When we talk about the whole unmasking process, a lot of people feel like the idea is that you're going to carve away all of this masking that you've done to please other people, and that your real self is waiting in here, ready to speak up and be autonomous. But really, that's not quite the case. I think that while everybody else was really developing their sense of self and their personality, we were developing a mask.
That's Sol Smith, author of The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery. Why do so many autistic and neurodivergent adults grow up doubting their own competence, even when they're highly capable? How does imposter syndrome take root in mixed messages about intelligence, effort, and worth? And what does it really take to begin trusting yourself after years of masking and second-guessing? I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and a conversation with Sol Smith is ahead on episode 304.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
We don't always talk about productivity as a mental health issue, but for many ADHD adults, it absolutely is. Chronic difficulty meeting daily demands doesn't just create logistical problems, it creates repeated failure experiences. And over time, those experiences shape self-concept, relationships, mood, and hope. Missed deadlines turn into shame. Unfinished tasks turn into conflict. And eventually, clients stop trusting themselves, which is where anxiety, depression, and burnout often take hold. That's why interventions that target productivity aren't about making people more efficient. They're about interrupting a cycle that quietly erodes mental health. That's the focus of a live APA and NBCC-approved CE training happening February 6th. It's going to be facilitated by Dr. Ari Tuckman, and this 1.5-hour continuing education training is focused on helping clinicians address the psychological factors that influence ADHDers, not just looking at the surface-level behaviors. Because when clients experience fewer failures, everything else in the world gets lighter, including the therapy itself. If you'd like to attend this training or access the recording, you can click the link in the show notes or find the link at neurodiversity.university. Hang on for Sol Smith.
On a recent episode of the Neurodiversity podcast.
Our state is considered to have one of the better school systems in the country.
Right.
So I think students are being really left behind. And I think that gap, particularly with the federal funding, but also state and local funding, and we tend to rely mostly on local funding and real estate taxes to fund our schools, which means that wealthier areas have better resources, and areas that are struggling more economically have less resources. So it creates that equity right there. And again, puts that work on the families to fill those gaps.
That's episode 290, Building Henry's Classroom, an advocacy masterclass. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking with Sol Smith, author of The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery and founder of the NeuroSpicy Community. If you've come across his work online, you know he brings this really thoughtful blend of lived experience. He's autistic, dyslexic, and ADHD, and the perspective of someone who spent more than 20 years teaching before shifting into full-time advocacy and coaching. Sol has become a go-to voice for helping neurodivergent adults understand themselves more deeply, unmask, and build real autonomy. Sol, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
In a lot of conversations I have with autistic adults, there's this theme of carrying mixed messages from childhood about competence, capability, and whether their instincts can really be trusted. And that blends really naturally into this imposter syndrome where people feel like they've just kind of slipped through the cracks and they're just waiting to be found out that they are different or that they don't fit in. I'd love to talk a little bit about how imposter syndrome tends to show up for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent adults and what you've seen help people begin to rewrite that narrative.
I mean, imposter syndrome is just kind of a daily reality for autistics and can be a little different for ADHDers, but they definitely have some of that too. And I know that for myself, I just very naturally do the masking to fit in and eventually sort of become the person that people expect you to be. Mm-hmm. And you of course, we don't know the internal worlds of other people. And we sort of think that other people are doing this too. And like for me, once I was an adult and I'm going to meetings or something, I would just sit there and think like, do they really feel like adults? Like, do they really feel like this is, you know what I mean? Like, am I the only one? If I were just to say, hey, can we just stop pretending? How many of them would be on board? Like, it could be all of them. It could be none of them. Like, it was always a mystery to me that it always felt like there was just this like charade going on. And, so far as I can tell, the way that I would explain just the phenomenon of not even feeling like an adult is I feel like the typical way to brain development is to trim away these synapses. Mm-hmm. You recycle them every so often, and that they just kind of forget what it was like to be younger. And they like sort of believe this sort of story of authority and hierarchy and stuff in a way that we just don't. So everything feels very pretend when, there's hierarchies in place and you don't feel hierarchy. It feels very much like a stage play, A good way of kind of seeing that is I read this book about asexuality. And what was really interesting to me was one of the people said that he has to constantly remind himself when he's watching a movie that this romance thing is not pretend for other people. That for him, it feels like a plot device. It feels like a way to try to push things forward. And he has to remind himself, wow, that's really how people think. And that's like hierarchy, I think, for autistics is like you just have to remind yourself, this is not like a plot device. It's not an organizational chart. So yeah, we always feel a little bit out of place. We're just not on the same wavelength as other people. And this hurts a lot when you realize that you are autistic. So you realize that you are autistic, and almost everyone I've talked to, their first reaction is, but am I really, or am I faking autism? Because we know so many people who've been faking autism. But you're so used to being an imposter that you can convince yourself that this is also another aspect of that, of you trying to meet some sort of expectations. And I just find that's really sad that we kind of have this removal of our identity early on, and it's really hard to get it back. When we talk about the whole unmasking process, a lot of people feel like the idea is that you're going to carve away all of this masking that you've done to please other people, and that your real self is waiting in here, ready to speak up and be autonomous. But really, that's not quite the case. So far as I can tell, I think that while everybody else was really developing their sense of self and their personality, we were developing a mask. And we didn't finish developing a lot of things. So there ends up being a lot that you don't know about yourself. And when you don't know a lot about yourself, like, of course you can feel like an imposter. And I try to tell autistics who come to me that like, it's not so much that you're digging down to find someone. It's that you have to finish developing it. You have to like explore things and see what motivates you. What do you want, for yourself? What are you interested in? And there's just these little clues that you can follow until you start to have a better sense of self. And I mean, it can be a pretty extreme shift for a lot of people. I've met plenty of autistics who have realized that, their sexuality is different, that their gender identity is different. I mean, stuff that they've just matched what the world told them to be, and it never felt right.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that we have the imposter syndrome, but I feel like getting rid of it is a pretty monumental task. And it just comes down to like really trying to figure out who you are and how you can show up in the world. Because we're so used to being too much, and we're like, going into a room and just kind of being like, well, how much of me is allowed in here?
Yeah.
Because different roles happen in different places, and sometimes it can be very confusing.
Yeah, I totally agree. As we think about what it really means as far as neurodivergent identity, I feel like even the language that we use really shapes how someone understands themselves. I've heard you offer a really thoughtful explanation of why you use identity-first language and why that feels meaningful for many autistic people. I talk to folks about this all the time, and I explain my reasoning for it, just for anyone who's listening who's maybe not sure what we mean by those terms. So especially in the fields of education, where you kind of came up through the field of education, as did I,
right?
Or mental health, all of these things. You're trained professionally to use person-first language when you talk about disabilities. So like a person with autism or someone who has ADHD. And a lot of the neurodiversity community, as I'm sure people have probably noticed listening to the podcast, use identity-first language. So an autistic person or an ADHDer. I would love for you to just walk us through your thinking on how you explain the importance of identity-first language and how you kind of came to some of those conclusions.
I get asked this a lot, and people will comment or message me and say, hey, would you mind, changing to where you say a person with autism because you are a person first. I see autism as a description of who you are. It's a description of the way that your nervous system is. It's a description of the way you show up, and that there's nothing dehumanizing about that. The same way that I'm a bald man, it's an adjective. It describes me. It's easier to pick me out because I'm bald. We do this with race. We do this with a lot of different things. You describe it first and then the person. So I do think that by doing the other way around, someone with autism is stigmatizing. And I can compare this to, like, we don't say like a cancerous person, it's a person with cancer. We don't want cancer. We'd like to be able to get rid of it. So it's not something that we like to have describe us. It's not something that we like to have be a way that people frame their experience with us. But I think that by framing it as an autistic person, you are inviting somebody to take a step towards them, in this double empathy problem, to understand that this may not match your expectations and that you have to meet us halfway there. And which, of course, usually doesn't happen, but it'd be nice.
Yeah. Well, it's not modifiable.
Right.
The cancer piece, you treat that and you're hoping to, like, it is a disease that you are trying to get rid of. And I think that that's part of the difference when we talk about neurodivergent. It is pervasive in how someone shows up in the world.
Yes.
And so wanting just really to make sure that that's kind of recognized.
Yeah. And it's not modifiable. It's part of who you are. And we don't want people to carry a lot of shame about it. We might get to a point where, that kind of thing doesn't bother people as much. I had a student once, we were talking a lot about different identity issues, and somebody said, I just don't understand why sexuality is such a big deal. Like, why does it matter who you're attracted to? Why is this such a subject? And it struck me as that's a really privileged take. For somebody who has had all of these trailblazers come along and make it where hypothetically we have some equality for the LGBTQIA folk, to be able to think like, this isn't that big of a deal. Why do we have to pay attention to it? It could almost be seen as a sign of progress.
Right.
And we have a generation of people who has better descriptions for themselves. They have a better self-awareness than we got to have. Just when you have a name for something, it's better way to sort of identify these things. And I think that it's worth imagining that we may get to some sort of a point where somebody like really thinks, why does it matter so much if why do you have to point out that you're autistic? But for the most part, when people say this now, it's sort of like, it's more stigmatizing. When somebody says, well, we're all a little bit autistic, so why do, we have to say that? And it's, of course, just a terrible take.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about how autistic people process information. People may have heard these terms. I hear them often talking about bottom-up versus top-down processing. But I think sometimes it's important to recognize that there's not necessarily a universal definition of what those terms mean. People use it differently.
Yeah.
Some describe it as like sensory first versus cognitive first. Others tie it to emotional regulation. So just to ground us, though, how do you define bottom-up and top-down processing? And how does that framework help better understand the autistic experience?
Yeah, this is one of those ones that it is very hard to describe. And if you are super academic, you could frame this as inductive versus deductive reasoning. But that's hard to describe too. And the reason I cite that is because I remember a couple of years ago, one of my kids coming to me with their textbook and saying, like, this is confusing me, inductive versus deductive. And I read the examples that they had, and they were both deductive, despite the labeled one as inductive, and they just had it all wrong. And it really frustrates me that happens, because it is kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around if you aren't thinking about how people think very much. I happen to be obsessed with such a thing, so it was kind of easier for me. So I see, bottom up being you are constructing your ideas of things based on all of the pieces at play, all of what you can observe. You put it together to have an idea of what something is, versus top down, which is you start with a comparison to a concept that you already know, and then you can generalize your knowledge about everything else. So that, and this sounds painfully inspecific. A restaurant's a good example that you are in a restaurant. You can be picturing anything if I say you're in a restaurant. And for the most part, a top-down thinker understands that there are certain behaviors, certain things to expect within a restaurant, and it doesn't matter if they're talking about a diner or a fine dining place or whatever. This is one concept that sort of umbrellas everything. For a bottom-up thinker, there's a lot more pieces at play here. So, like, you're sitting down, it's noisy, there's smells, there's forks and scraping on plates, people walking around taking your order, versus making an order at a counter. All of these little different parts can be really overwhelming because you're processing all of this instead of using a label to substitute for that processing, which is essentially what top-down thinking is. Another favorite example is panda bears.
Yeah.
It's relatively recently that the Western world really understood that the panda bear is a real thing, within the last 100 years or so. And it was otherwise thought to be, some sort of a legend or something. And the first thing you do when you to get some sort of legendary animal like a panda bear, you name it, and then you give it its Latin name. And now it's like all this sort of curiosity seems to die about it in many ways, that, we substitute that label for an understanding. And you teach a kid, this is a panda bear. And like, you're kind of, for the most part, kind of done unless you're really doing a deep dive. But it just kind of takes away from the fact that this is a really fascinating creature. It's this black and white fuzzy animal who sits and eats bamboo and kind of does some clumsy movements. I mean, like, all of those different parts make a much more interesting and detailed picture than just a name. Mm-hmm. So where I really kind of started seeing this really take root was in my one of my classes I taught. It was a media literacy section that I would do in my writing class. And the first thing I would do is try to get them to think about advertising differently. So we would take a look at advertising and its place in our culture. So one of the things that I did was teach them how to do analysis of a print advertisement. And what we did was we looked at 3 different levels. So the first level is, okay, you're looking at a print ad. The first level is, what do you literally see here? Tell me what's in this picture. The second level is, what's the intended message? Based on what we're seeing, what does the advertiser want you to take away from this? And almost anybody can get this intended message. They're usually not ambiguous. And then number 3 is, what's the cultural stereotype that they used to make that message come across? And I thought this was just a brilliant system, right? So I would put up a slideshow of ads, and we get to the first one, and I would say, okay, what do you see in this ad? And the students would go, Coke is delicious and refreshing. And I'm like, no, yeah, that's level 2. What do you see in this ad? And they're like, happy people like Coke. And I'm like, no. Level 1, what do you literally see here? And it's like, Coke makes you happy. And I'm like, no.
You're interpreting it.
Yeah. And I'm like, no, this is saying, like, what you're seeing is a woman sitting on the beach in a bikini, smiling, holding a bottle of Coke.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, oh, yeah. But they jump to that second level. So a top-down thinker jumps to a second level because the details in any situation use cognitive energy. Mm-hmm. And so jumping to that second level meaning feels very literal to a top-down thinker. And this is why it can be very frustrating if you're arguing with somebody and they're top-down and you're bottom-up, and you say something like, hey, that one thing that you did on Thursday I felt was really inconsiderate, and I would like if we avoided that kind of thing in the future. And the person who's the top-down thinker can go, I'm sorry you think I'm a terrible and inconsiderate person. And it's like, no, I don't think you're an inconsiderate person. There's this one thing, it's one thing I would like modified. But they will usually jump to this generalization to say, like, only an inconsiderate person would do something inconsiderate. And that's not the case, that everybody can do that. And so, like, you just kind of get into the weeds a little bit more when you're a bottom-up thinker. And this means using a lot more processing power, and it's cognitively exhausting. And that's, one reason why we see autistics wanting to have a predictable routine, being comfortable only in predictable spaces, because they don't have to think about it as much. If you build a predictable routine in a place that you know very well, it's sort of like a neurotypical simulator. You don't have to think about all of that stuff, and you can use your energy for the stuff.
So as a mental health counselor, when I'm working with my clients, I find that my bottom-up processors, you have to be really explicit, like to break things down, to give all of the information so that there's kind of this piece where they can kind of build on all those things.
Yes.
As opposed to those assumptions that are based on like the hidden social rules or, kind of this intuitive inferencing that doesn't always come as automatically. Whether you are neurodivergent or whether you are working with neurodivergent people or a parent or whatever it might be, it influences that communication.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about meta messages, because I feel like that fits pretty closely with this. And recognizing like there's this extra step of interpretation that some people just don't naturally engage in. For autistic folks, it really increases that cognitive load and can shift a simple conversation into something much more overwhelming. How do you describe meta messages to people who use them all the time without realizing it, and what helps bridge that gap?
Lots of times people don't understand when they're sending a meta message. Essentially, you are saying something without saying it. The meaning is in between the words. There's a suggested meaning there that you want the other person to pick up on. And sometimes this can be you want something for your birthday, but you want them to express their givingness. You want them to be able to anticipate what you want. So you don't want to tell them directly what you want. You want to sort of invite them to have that idea. But that's not nearly as pervasive as something like talking with your boss, and your boss doesn't want to necessarily be bossy. You have these different, like these weird roles in the workplace that can be really hard, where there's a, parasocial friendship thing going on. And then there's also coworker, and then there's also the boss relationship. And lots of times they like to have this sort of like, we're all friends here type vibe. And a good example is I was department chair of the liberal arts, and my boss was saying, hey, I really don't like the way this professor is teaching art history. They're doing it non-linearly. It feels really weird to me. I get that they're doing themes, but I don't like it. And I was like, oh, yeah, that is not how I would do it. I said, I feel like it's really counterintuitive, and it bothers me too. So a couple weeks later, my boss says, okay, so did you fix that class? And I'm sorry. And I was like, I'm sorry. And she goes, you told them that they need to teach it the other way. And I was like, no. And she said, but I literally told you that I want you to correct this. And I'm like, no, you didn't. I said, I thought we were just having a conversation about how we wouldn't do it that way. Like that didn't have anything to do with what she's going to do. And yeah, there's just this implicit demand there. There's an implicit command happening that you'll just completely miss. So it can be really hard. So yeah, autistics tend to be very direct, but I have noticed that in many cases, we are indirect about our feelings or indirect about our needs. When it comes to our own needs, we're afraid that we're going to be an inconvenience. We're used to the masking, the people pleasing. And instead of saying, I really need some quiet time or whatever, you might suggest it. And if the people in your family have been, trained by you that you're a very direct communicator, don't be offended if it feels a little bit aggressive to you that I'm direct. And then you're very indirect about what you want, and they don't pick up on it, it can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating for both people because, they don't want to be uncaring, but they were looking for you to say, hey, I need some alone time. Not, I'm really overwhelmed right now, and I just really kind of don't know what to do. There's so much going on. Instead of being invited for that, they should have said, been direct about it. But lots of times when you're in discussion with somebody, going back to that argument earlier about I didn't like that thing that happened Thursday, lots of times, especially in a conflict, the neurotypical person or an autistic person will not be direct unless they are being very aggressive. So once you are direct, this feels aggressive, this feels pointed, and that's not really the intention. That like when two people are in a disagreement about something, an autistic will usually be pointing out a pattern. It's either a pattern of behavior or actions or whatever that needs to be addressed. And it feels to the neurotypical person like you're picking me apart. You know, you jumped to something that happened 3 years ago, and it's just you're pulling me apart. I didn't know you were holding on to all this resentment. And for us, it's like, no. Like, I'm just saying this is like that time when that happened, and that's like the time when this happened, and I don't want to see it repeat itself. And for them, in an argument, they're much more likely to be like, you know, you're such a jerk. I wish I never met you. And that to us, like, wow, that's huge. But later on, they can go, I was really upset, and I was just trying to like, you know, get your attention and be upset. I'm sorry. But then you're like, well, I'm really sorry for what I said about, and they're like, no, you meant that because you had all this stuff cataloged, you know? So it's really hard to apologize for these really specific things, where if you make a much more global complaint about somebody, it's easier to try to, you know, that was an emotional reaction. We're all good now.
Yeah.
And so it can be really frustrating.
I had something recently where I had an email and I got called out for not replying to this email. So I went back to the email and I was looking at it, and finally I replied back to this person, and I'm like, am I supposed to do something with this information? Because like, I'm going to need some more explicit information about what you're actually asking me to do, because there was no information there.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that people learn. It's like you learn to then, how do you self-advocate? How do you communicate? How do you ask for the things that you need to make sure that it's clear?
Right. And sometimes, you know, there's a sort of hidden meaning in something that we might not track, that like something practical doesn't address. I mean, a good example is like somebody might really like a diamond ring, but it's a really impractical use of money, and you don't really use that diamond for anything, despite the fact that diamonds can be really useful. It's something that might seem kind of pointless, but in certain cultures, it's extremely meaningful and almost a requirement of a relationship moving forward, and in you know, certain decades and certain cultures. And so it's all of that context is assumed. It's basically assumed reality for an autistic person. So they don't think about the fact that they're doing meta messages. They don't think about the fact that they're imbuing meaning in something that is not inherently meaningful. And they would experience this if they moved to Japan, you know, and suddenly there are behaviors and traditions and things that are rude that you didn't know were rude, and things that are polite that you didn't realize were polite. And it feels like you're very out of place. And that's kind of how we live our life, is constantly adapting to these unexpected little shifts of reality, essentially, that meaning is contextual. And people are just not supplying the context because they're not even aware that it's there. You know, it's like a fish in water. What is water? They're not even aware it's there. So it can be a lot for an autistic person. That's why, you know, lots of times, and this links in with the bottom-up processing as well, asking for more context. This can happen at a job, or it can happen like in a classroom. I used to ask my math teachers, you know, but why are we doing this equation? Like, why, like, how did we get here? And I'm looking for more context because things are very abstract. Like, I get it, there's numbers, but I want to see an application, because if there's a meaning behind it, I can feel a more meaningful connection to what I'm learning. So I would ask, like, why are we doing it this way? And what the math teacher would hear, because they're very math smart, it's very obvious to them. They think you're questioning them, essentially saying, like, I'm never going to use this.
Right. You're being defiant.
Yeah. And like, that's not it at all. Like, you're asking for more context. And in the workplace, asking for more context, you know, they're like, well, we want you to go and take care of the gala. And you're like, okay, well, what do you want me to do about the gala? Like, how do you mean take care of it? And that feels like pushback. And to us, it just feels like, okay, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by this. A good example is like, I'd like you to dress more professionally. And I go, okay, what do you mean by more professionally? Because I see, you know, he's wearing jeans and she's wearing shoes and tennis shoes. So what about me is unprofessional? And again, they think that that's defiance, but
I'm just asking for information.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because professional, it's entirely subjective.
Yeah.
Has everything to do with the context.
Absolutely. And I think that's so key. I feel like we talk so much and encourage folks to like self-advocate, but I think also people who are not neurodivergent who suggest that don't always understand how hard that can be because of those types of reactions.
Yes.
It's like, how do we help people feel comfortable to approach us with those questions and just go like, there's no judgment. Yeah, just ask away. And but I think that requires that person to then recognize, like, to keep their own stuff in check a little bit. Like, it's not about you.
Yeah, that's a huge one. That it's not about you is something that I've found myself saying a lot, like especially in conflicts or something where I'm like, whoa, this is about me. And yeah, it is very hard. I think that to whom someone is advocating, that you have to sort of be, we're asking an Autistic to be a little out of their comfort zone and to recognize that the lived experience here is something that you can't understand fully. And even just understanding that you can't understand it is a big step.
Right.
Because in their experience, everybody got this before.
Yeah.
And I've seen you do all of this in a weekend, so why can't you do it in this weekend? And there's just so many factors going on for an autistic person where something they've accomplished before can set an expectation that's unrealistic in other conditions.
Yeah. I love all of this. And this time has just flown by so quickly.
I know.
Before we wrap up, I have one last question for you. So if you were talking to a neurodivergent person who is just beginning to unmask and be more authentic in their lives, what would you say to them? What is it that you would really just want them to hear?
I would want them to hear that, there's nothing wrong with you. Just because the environment isn't something that you're fitting comfortably into. And one of the best ways that you can really see that there's nothing inherently wrong with you is to talk to other autistics, talk to people who are, either starting or further down the road in this journey. And you feel seen, you feel validated. And that's something that we're missing. We're missing it from the culture. We don't see that very often. We're missing it from our role models. We don't have very many. And so we really do have to open up communication together, I think, to really find a sense of belonging that can then give you the confidence to function better in this world.
Sol Smith, author of The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I keep thinking about how neurodivergent adults are often described as so smart, and how damaging that unfinished sentence can be over time. When effort and struggle or difference gets mistaken for incapability, it's easy to internalize the idea that your success is fragile or accidental. What I really appreciated about this conversation is the reminder that competence isn't about ease. It's about effectiveness, adaptability, and growth. And maybe part of the work, especially in adulthood, is learning to recognize our own competence, even when it doesn't look like everyone else's. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks to Sol Smith. What a great conversation. We have links to check out his work in the show notes. Also, find links to all of our social media accounts so you can join with like-minded people to talk about stuff. And one more thing, therapists, don't forget our CE training that happens this Friday, the 6th of February, where we will learn about the psychological repercussions of ADHD, not just the surface-level challenges. You can join us live or get the recorded version, either way. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris, for all of us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.